The rain had started just after 9, a relentless downpour that turned the desolate stretch of Highway 61 into a shimmering black void. Mandy had been driving trucks for nearly a decade, and she'd seen plenty of nights like this. Cold, wet, and unforgiving. But there was something about this stretch of road, deep in the heart of the Midwest, that made her uneasy. The dashboard clock glowed 11:46 p.m., and the radio had been nothing but static for miles. Her wipers struggled against the heavy rain, barely keeping her view clear. Every few miles, the headlights caught glimpses of the fog creeping in, thick and low, as if it was alive and searching for something. The truck's engine rumbled steadily, its familiar sound comforting against the isolation outside. Mandy had heard the stories about Highway 61. Truckers swapped tales at rest stops, about shadowy figures appearing on the road, hitchhikers who vanished, even ghostly apparitions following alongside their rigs. She always brushed it off as nonsense, the kind of campfire tales you'd tell to pass the time. But tonight felt different. Her hands gripped the wheel tighter, the cold air seeping through the small cracks of her cab. She hadn't seen another vehicle in over an hour, and the longer the road stretched on, the heavier the silence weighed on her. Even the hum of her CB radio seemed to have died, leaving her completely cut off from the world. A faint shape flickered at the edge of her vision, something off the side of the highway. Mandy squinted into the rain. There, just for a moment, she swore she saw a person. A man, maybe, standing by the side of the road, her stomach knotted. She kept driving. Probably just her imagination, a trick of the fog. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. A few miles passed, and then again, out of the corner of her eye. There he was. Closer this time. Standing just at the edge of the guardrail, soaked in the rain, but still as a statue. Mandy's breath quickened. It had to be a coincidence, some lost hitchhiker waiting for someone to pick him up in this weather. But why would he keep showing up? Her foot pressed harder on the gas pedal. Another few miles. Her knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and her eyes darted from the road to her mirrors. She kept glancing at the side of the highway, afraid to see him again. She didn't want to, but part of her needed to know if he was still there. The next time he appeared, it was dead ahead, directly in the road. Mandy slammed on the brakes, the tires squealing as the rig fought against the wet pavement. Her truck lurched violently, throwing her forward. Heart pounding, she struggled to regain control, eyes wide with terror, as the figure stood motionless in her high beams. Then, in an instant, gone. The rain pelted the windshield, the wipers clattering back and forth. The road was empty. Mandy sat frozen, her heart in her throat, hands trembling as they hovered over the steering wheel. She gasped for air, convinced she'd hit someone, but there was no body, no blood, just the rain and the empty highway. Her throat tightened as she slowly eased her foot off the brake. The truck rolled forward, the headlights cutting through the rain again. Her mind raced. Was she hallucinating? Was it the long hours? The weather? She needed to get to the next rest stop. She couldn't stay on this road any longer. Pushing the truck back up to speed, she kept her eyes glued to the pavement, willing herself not to look at the sides of the road again. Whatever it was, it couldn't be real. But she couldn't shake the fear gnawing at her insides, the feeling that something was watching her, just beyond the reach of her headlights. As she rounded a bend, her headlights illuminated a small sign in the distance. Rest area, 5 miles. Relief washed over her, and she nearly cried. 5 more miles. She could make it. But then, from the shadows ahead, he stepped onto the road again. Mandy screamed, jerking the wheel to the left. The truck skidded, and for a split second, she lost control. The figure was right in front of her, pale, drenched, eyes dark hollows in his face. Then the truck surged forward, and she braced for impact. Nothing The truck swerved back onto the road and she pulled it to a stop, her heart hammering in her chest. The figure was gone. The road was empty again. She couldn't breathe. Tears stung her eyes as she looked around, the rain still pouring down in sheets, the fog swirling in strange patterns. It was over. It had to be over. She forced herself to drive the last few miles to the rest area, shaking the whole way. When she finally pulled in and parked, she collapsed over the steering wheel, sobbing. Her whole body trembled as she fumbled for her phone, checking the time. 12:15 a.m. It was behind her now, just a stretch of haunted highway, a stormy night, and her own mind playing tricks on her, or so she told herself. With a shaky breath, Mandy turned off the engine and slumped back in her seat. For a moment, all was quiet, until from the darkness outside, there was a soft knock on the driver's side window. Mandy's breath caught in her throat as the soft knock echoed in her cab. She froze, eyes wide, staring straight ahead at the rain-blurred windshield. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so hard her knuckles ached. For a moment, she convinced herself it was just a branch, or the wind playing tricks on her again. Then it came again. Tears welled in her eyes, her pulse hammering in her ears. She forced herself to look to her left, praying it was just her mind, just fatigue, but what she saw made her heart plummet. A face. Pale, soaked, and hollow-eyed, pressed against the glass. It was him, the figure from the road. The eyes, those dark, endless pits, stared directly at her, as though he could see straight into her soul. His mouth hung slightly open, lips blue and trembling, water dripping from his skin in heavy drops that splashed against the side of the truck. Mandy couldn't move. She wanted to scream, wanted to reach for her phone, anything to call for help. But her body was paralyzed, frozen in sheer terror. Her breath was shallow, coming in ragged gasps, her mind racing with the impossibility of it all. How could he be here? How could he be real? This time it was louder, more insistent. The figure didn't blink. His hand, pale and wet, was splayed against the glass now, and the knock came again, and again, like he was pleading to be let in. His hollow eyes fixed on hers, an expression of sadness etched into his face, though the terror in Mandy's chest told her something far darker lay behind those empty sockets. She couldn't stay here. Mandy's hand finally twitched, her fingers slowly curling toward the ignition. The sound of her keys clinking in the silence felt deafening, and with one desperate movement, she turned the engine back on. The roar of the truck's engine gave her a second of comfort, something real, something powerful that drowned out the horror pressing in on her from the other side of the window. She jammed the truck into gear and punched the gas. The vehicle lurched forward, spraying water from its tires as it rumbled out of the rest area and back onto the highway. She couldn't look to her left again, couldn't risk seeing him still there, still watching her. As she pulled onto the highway, the rain hammered harder, drowning out everything but the thudding of her own heart. Her headlights sliced through the thick fog, and for a moment, Mandy allowed herself to believe she'd escaped, that she was leaving him behind on that cold, wet stretch of Highway 61. But then, from somewhere behind her, she heard a sound that made her blood run cold. A knock from inside the cab. She glanced in the rearview mirror, heart pounding. The inside of her trailer was dark, but through the reflection, something moved, a faint shift in the shadows. It couldn't be. Her breath quickened as she strained to hear over the pounding rain. Another knock, this time from the back of the truck. Mandy's mind raced. She gripped the steering wheel so hard her fingers ached. Her eyes darted between the road ahead and the mirror. The truck was moving too fast to stop now, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was back there, in the trailer. The knocks grew louder, more insistent. They reverberated through the cab, each one pounding in time with her racing pulse. She had to know. She had to see what it was. With trembling hands, she reached for the latch that separated the cab from the back of the truck. She hesitated, her fingers hovering just inches from it. But the knocks wouldn't stop. They were relentless now, echoing through the tight space, filling her head with a rising sense of dread. She yanked the latch open and swung the door back, her heart leaping into her throat as the interior of the trailer came into view. It was empty. For a split second, she allowed herself to believe it was over. Just her imagination, just the storm playing tricks on her. But as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she noticed something at the far end of the trailer. A shadow. A figure. He was standing there, pale and dripping, his hollow eyes locked on hers. Mandy screamed and slammed the door shut, her hands shaking violently. She punched the accelerator, the truck roaring down the highway, careening wildly as she fought to keep it steady. Tears streamed down her face, mingling with the sweat dripping down her neck. The knocks returned, this time from all around her. They echoed through the cab, through the walls of the trailer, as though the figure was inside the very metal of the truck itself, closing in on her from all sides.
"Please, God,"
she sobbed, her voice breaking as she pounded the steering wheel. The rain poured harder, the fog thickened, and the road ahead disappeared into a blur of darkness. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. She could only drive, faster and faster, desperate to outrun the terror that clung to her. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. The cab went deathly quiet, save for the hum of the engine and the rhythm of her breathing. Mandy's heart pounded in her chest, her hands shaking violently as she loosened her grip on the wheel. She glanced in the mirror again. The trailer was empty. The figure was gone. She slowed the truck, pulling off onto the shoulder of the highway. The rain was beginning to let up, the storm losing its fury. She sat there for a long time, gasping for air, trying to steady her trembling body. The terror that had gripped her was starting to fade, replaced by a numb disbelief. It was over. Whatever had happened on that dark stretch of Highway 61, whether it was real or a nightmare brought on by exhaustion, it was behind her now. She was safe. Mandy slumped back in her seat, wiping the tears from her eyes. She laughed, shakily, almost hysterically. The road stretched out before her, quiet and empty. She would drive on, and soon, this night would be nothing more than a distant memory, a story to tell when the daylight made everything feel less terrifying.